My name is Alex Babanu. I'm an identity solutions architect with Nolly. I'm going to talk to you today about identity and access management solutions, what they are, and why companies and organizations need them. So first of all, throughout this presentation, you will see quite often the acronym IAM. This stands for Identity and Access Management. Simple. So first of all, we'll have a look at the drivers behind IAM solutions. And then we'll understand what identity and access management solutions are, what actually is identity and access management. We'll look at the differences between authentication and authorization, which are the two pillars of identity of access management. We'll have a look at the ecosystem of an IAM deployment. We'll look at typical topologies. We'll understand what federation is. And finally, we'll have a look at the challenges that face any IAM projects. So then, jumping right into it, let's have a look at the drivers behind IAM solutions. Why would an organization want to spend money and time implementing such complex systems and components? So first of all, one of the main drivers is compliance and regulatory compliance and governance. Over the years, we've had such regulations as the Sarbanes-Oxley, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, for example, for financial institutions, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Acts for healthcare and health-related applications. So these regulations require companies to record and keep track of who accesses what. So then why governance? Why have legislators implemented these acts over the years? Well, for improved enhanced security and traceability. So why security? As we know, security is becoming very concerning aspect for many organizations and many people worldwide. And it's quite simple to see why. Looking at the past year, we have a lot of examples of breaches, of security breaches. So this is for Canada alone in the past 12 months. We see some fairly concerning breaches. For example, with the provincial government, we have something like 15,000 user identities stolen. But if we look at the numbers worldwide, we see that the concern are exponentially worse. We have millions and sometimes billions of identities that are regularly stolen in such big organizations as JP Morgan, Home Depot, eBay. We hear about these in the news, and they are quite big and quite concerning. Like, for example, the Korean Credit Bureau has had 104 million identities stolen, which is something like 40% of their population. So these concerns can be mitigated. How? Well, using Galileo Galilei's words, measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. And this is exactly what those regulations and those acts attempt to achieve. So what are the solutions then? How can we mitigate the risk? Well, first of all, we need to understand that breaches become unavoidable. So secure the data, not the perimeter. The perimeter is becoming more and more porous over the years. With smarter and smarter outsiders or even insiders. It is actually more important now to secure the data itself rather than the perimeter. And finally, we need to ensure that all the accesses to all the resources are properly checked and at least recorded. So the risks can be mitigated by controlling the user access and authentication, by encrypting all the sensitive data, and by managing and storing all encryption keys. What we're going to focus on in this presentation is controlling the user access and authentication. And this is exactly what identity and access management is ensuring that only the right users can access the right resources. There are also other drivers for IAM solutions. One is business process improvements. Typically, business processes such as user lifecycle processes, such as hires and terminations, can be automated and streamlined, which simplifies their management and reduces costs. It could also lead to automated user account lifecycle, which reduce operational costs and increase staff productivity. It also improves user experience. It enables user self-service for password resets, which reduces support calls. It reduces administration points and provides centralization of control for all user accesses. And they also provide centralized reporting and attestation. So all your reports and all the records are centralized in one single location. So then what is identity and access management? Well, here's the definition. Identity and access management is the security discipline that enables the right individuals to access the right resources at the right times for the right reasons. This one is provided by Gartner. So first of all, it is a security discipline. It is one of the pillars of digital security. And it enables the right people or individuals or identities to access the right resources at the right times for the right reasons. So one of the first things we need to understand is what exactly is an identity, because it's part of the name. It's also the thing we manage, and identities access resources. So an identity can have many forms nowadays. The most common one is it can be a person, a human, but it can also be a device such as a smartphone or a tablet or a computer. It can also be a device connected to the internet that is not actually managed or handled by a person at all, such as here, for example, in the smart city paradigm, we could have smart sensors on the street connected to the internet. Or it could be in a house, it could be a smart sensor or a smart webcam or any device that makes up the Internet of Things. Those can each have their own identities. Finally, we can have a service. A service itself may be in the cloud or within the perimeter of the organization. A service itself can be an identity, can need access to something, and can need to provide credentials. So then, how do we define an identity? We define an identity by its attributes. And we have several types of attributes that define an identity. The most common one and the classic ones are things that pertain to the identity itself, like its name, its ID, maybe an address, an email address, maybe a social media ID, a password. If it's a device, it could be a device ID, maybe a serial number, things like that. The second type of attributes that may identify an identity are contextual data. And these could be the IP address of the identity, if it's a device, for example, the client device ID, the keyboard frequency data, if we're recording that. For every user has a different frequency of typing, so this could be recorded. It could be mouse movements, biometric data. This will actually be here. It could be also roles, things such as if the identity is a manager or an administrator or such. Last and not least, an identity may also have a set of tracking data. The last time it has logged in, the number of failed logins, and the account status, etc., etc. So all of these attributes together make up the identity and are relevant for access management. So the IAM components are various. There are three main components when we talk about IAM solutions. On the left-hand side, we have identity management solutions and products. On the right-hand side, we have access management products and solutions. And in the middle, kind of sitting in between, we have password management solutions. So identity management solutions worry and manage and handle several items, in particular identity lifecycle management, such as create, update, delete, deactivate, activate user accounts, or account provisioning, if we need to automate the creation of things like mailboxes or access to specific resources, or also provide a catalog of resources that a user can request access to. Identity management solutions also provide role management and the ability to assign roles to users and manage those assignments. On the right-hand side, access management solutions provide features such as authentication and authorization, and we'll get back to these in a bit, single sign-on, federation, N-factor authentication, and adaptive authentication. All of these are various ways of granting access to specific resources. Sitting in between, we have password management solutions, and these provide features such as user self-service, such as password reset, answer security questions, provide features for restoring forgotten passwords, or accessing and updating personal data. But they also provide features for administration, such as implementing password policies or question and answer policies and anything related to that. So password management sits in between because some solutions, some features of password management are oftentimes included in identity management products and sometimes in access management products. So depending on what we're looking at, it could be separate or it could be part of either or of these other systems. Moving on, we'll have a look at the two pillars that make up access management, which are authentication and authorization. Authentication is essentially like the front gate to your castle. It's either you let the user in or out, and you check the credentials of the user. If the credentials match and are valid, then you let the user into your castle. Authorization, on the other hand, happens once the user access has entered your castle. Authorization takes care of what doors can that user open, what stairway can they access, where can they look. Authorization ensures that only the right rooms in your castle are accessible by the user. So looking at them side by side, here's the type of differences and items that pertain to both. On the left-hand side, authentication has a combination of any of the following factors. As a first factor, authentication ensures that we check something that the user knows, something that you know, and typically it's a password or a passphrase. A second level of authentication ensures that you have something. Authentication ensures you have either a token or a soft token or a smart card or a specific device. So this is what you have. A third level of authentication could be what you are. This uses biometric data. You could use your fingerprint, your iris, your heartbeat. A fourth level of authentication can use your habits, possibly your location or IP address, your mouse movements, which are unique to users, your keyboard strikes, all of these factors. So this is why we sometimes refer to N-factor authentication, whether we use any of these factors or any combination. On the other side, authorization. Once we have access to the castle, then what rooms, what subsystems can we access? Well, there are two types of authorization. We have coarse grain and fine grain. Coarse grain gives high-level entitlements, like give broad level access to one given feature or one given subsystem. Or it could be something like ability to do a get or a put or a post or a patch if we're doing HTTP requests. Fine-grained authorization, on the other hand, is focused on the detailed or explicit entitlements. It could be specific features of a subsystem, or it could be something based on context, such as role or time of day or location. So fine-grained authorization can be rather complicated depending on the requirements. So those two pillars, authentication and authorization, define together access management. Identity and access management systems have a complex ecosystem of components that make up a typical deployment. Let's have a look at what a standard IAM implementation looks like. The following diagram gives a high-level overview of the components you would expect to see in an IAM deployment. At the center lies the identity management and security infrastructure, which is comprised of four main subcomponents. This could be encapsulated within a single server or separated or even in the cloud, depending on the vendor selected. The IAM infrastructure components are the user provisioning for automating the user account lifecycle, such as user account creation, modification, or deletion. Access governance to manage the access to protected resources. This could be protected apps or servers, enterprise applications, or anything similar to that. Single sign-on to prevent users from having to type their passwords over and over again every time they access a different resource they are entitled for. And password management to store and enable the modification of passwords. This also enables users to reset their passwords or to handle forgotten password cases. The IAM infrastructure relies on data stores at the bottom, which typically use LDAP directories, but can also use a wide range of databases. On the left lie the identity inputs. These are the sources of the identities managed by the IAM systems. Identities are created here, either through data feeds from enterprise HR systems, such as PeopleSoft, SAP, etc., or directly from databases or web services. Identities can also be created manually by admin users or by end users themselves through self-registration UIs. These identity feeds usually use APIs or connectors that the IAM infrastructure exposes. These interfaces allow for all possible and allowed operations on identity accounts, such as create, modify, unlock, etc. On the right, we find the enterprise infrastructure that we are protecting. The IAM infrastructure creates and maintains user accounts in these target systems, but also protects their access. In a typical flow, for example, a user is hired in, say, PeopleSoft HR. This event is then captured by the user provisioning component, which uses pre-configured rules to automatically create the adequate user accounts in the target enterprise systems. Later, when the new hire tries to access one such target system, the access governance component authenticates and authorizes the user. These deployments typically use open standards and specifications such as LDAP, SSL, JAuth, SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, JSON, etc., etc. So they require usually a wide range of knowledge. Let's have a look at identity federation. Identity federation is the means of linking a person's electronic identity and attributes stored across multiple distinct identity management systems. So what exactly does this mean, and why is this important nowadays? Well, it means that organizations often need to allow access to their own resources to external users they know nothing about, or external identities. And the problems we're trying to solve with federation is to allow those external identities to access our own resources. So the problem is that organizations have different identity repositories, and these are can be totally separated geographically and have nothing to do with each other. And so in order to enable federation, we need to identify and grant access to external users or identities that we know nothing about. The solution is to establish a circle of trust with the external organizations, as well as use federation standards. So let's have a look at those standards. There are a variety of competing identity federation standards. We make a distinction between two types of federation standards. One is authorization protocols, and the others are authentication protocols. We've seen that authorization and authentication are the two pillars of access management. So you have logically two types of federation standards. From the top, authorization protocols are essentially OAuth and OAuth 2, and authentication protocols are all the other ones listed on the diagram, the most prominent being SAML and OpenID Connect, or ADFS for the Microsoft world, also Shibboleth. But there is a further distinction that can be made. The ones below are XML based, while the ones at the top are REST and JSON based, so more geared towards web applications and mobile devices. And you will see these federation standards implemented quite a lot throughout the internet. Let's have a look at what a SAML federation flow might look like. This is a rather intricate diagram, but if we follow the numbers, it's actually quite easy to follow. So at the bottom, we have a user that tries to access a resource, and that resource is actually protected by an identity provider. So right away, we can see that there are three actors or three roles that are defined in this SAML federation flow. There is the user agent or the browser. There is a service provider that owns a resource that the user tries to access. And there is an identity provider that can authenticate and authorize the user. So the user requests access to the resource. The service provider does an access check. So it redirects the user browser to the identity provider. The identity provider has a single sign-on service, and using that service, the identity provider redirects the user to a challenge for credential page, basically a login page. The user logs in, enters their credentials, and then if the credentials are successfully submitted, a response is forwarded back to the service provider in the form of a SAML assertion. This SAML assertion tells the service provider whether the user has successfully authenticated with the identity provider. If the assertion is positive, then the service provider simply supplies the resource to the user browser. So that is essentially a flow. Now, this service provider and identity provider can be totally remote and separated from each other. They don't have to know to be in the same location or even be owned by the same organization. Let's have a look at an auth flow, which is an authorization flow. This is a type of flow that you see very often when you're on a mobile device looking at an app and try to access another app. So in the auth flow that we illustrate here, we identify several roles. We have the user, who is the resource owner. The user has an account, a Twitter account, and also has a mobile app. There's a user agent, which can be a Firefox, which can be a Chrome or a Firefox, like a browser or an app, and a client app, which is something that runs on the user agent. So the user accesses this client app, and from there tries to access their Twitter feed. So Twitter needs to basically authorize this access request. So how does this work? The user goes to the user agent and runs the client app. The client app requires a token from Twitter, and that is an exchange, rather a complicated exchange of messages between the client app and Twitter following the auth flow, and eventually the result of this exchange is an access token, an auth access token that is sent back to the user agent and that can then be used to access the resource. Now, it is interesting to note here that the user must approve this request. So the user essentially must go to Twitter and say, yes, I agree this client to access my Twitter account. So anyway, this is an illustration of how federation and authorization works. So what then are the challenges that face IAM systems? Well, IAM differ from other types of projects in the following points. First of all, they are usually enterprise-wide. They impact many services and many departments, so they're not really vertical silos, but rather more broad. Depending on the type of implementation, they may impact most or all employees, especially if we implement access management systems. So therefore, they impact several teams and departments, and they require a lot of communication to bring everybody on board and to train users. So the challenges are summarized in this little table. On the left, we have identity management, on the right, access management. So from an identity management perspective, the main challenge is a change in business processes. Identity management has to do with user provisioning and the way we can automate identity creation and maintenance. And therefore, processes such as hires, terminations, and things like that in an organization may need to be revisited. They impact, therefore, many departments such as HR, DevOps, management, the team responsible for communications, user support centers, application teams, etc., etc. So there's a lot of communication involved, usually in identity management projects. Those projects also require end-user communication and training. If we provide features for password resets or user registration, the end users need to be trained to use those new interfaces. And finally, identity management requires diverse technologies such as connectors, proprietary APIs, standards, etc. On the access management side, well, the challenges are mostly technical. They have to do with load and benchmarking depending. It's essentially making sure we can authenticate and authorize a certain amount of people at any given point, including at peak hours. So there's a strong technical challenge there to ensure that we have things like session replication if need be, or high availability, or the middleware stack is optimized for high loads. There might be some development work involved for customizations, and there's lots of interaction required with the network and DevOps teams in particular. Access management projects don't necessarily have an impact on the end user. It's essentially just logging in, unless they require things like password reset changes and UI changes in that regard. So to conclude the challenges, well, all of these projects require C-level executive sponsorship. The higher the sponsor, the most successful the project would be. And they also require a very skilled implementation team. The team must know a broad array of technologies and systems and be able to react quickly and understand the needs of the various teams involved, including DevOps, HR, and many others. This concludes this introduction to identity and access management solutions. Please feel free to use my email if you have any further questions. Thank you.